Hi, everybody. Today we're going to spend some time talking about trauma, what it is, and how it works. We cannot offer trauma resolution until we understand what trauma is. So the first misconception that people typically have around trauma is the idea that we have sort of that emergency room definition of trauma, right? So the emergency room definition of trauma is some sort of medically compromising event, broken bones, gashes, wounds, and things like that. Now that obviously actually is traumatic as well and can cause some pretty significant challenges psychologically. But we're today talking about psychological trauma. Now, there's sort of three areas that we want to talk about. First, we'll talk about a broad, overarching definition of trauma, and then we'll talk about it from the perspective of the nervous system and from the perspective of the attachment system. So, the traditional psychological definition of trauma is anything less than nurturing that changes your perspective about yourself or the world. Thank you to my friend Jenny reminding me of that. And that's pretty straightforward, and it can encompass quite a bit of material from childhood and also from adulthood. So anything less than nurturing that changes your perspective, generally speaking, in a negative way, right? We're not going to consider trauma an event that changes your perspective for the better or causing you to find the world to be a more trusting place. Now, the other thing to consider is the limbic system, the fight, flight, freeze response in the brain. It's kind of an association machine. So if this is your brain, here's your little eyeball. Your limbic system is kind of tucked away right here, kind of behind your ear. And it's an association machine, and a lot of times what it'll do is it'll associate specific negative events that it cannot contextualize or figure out with trauma and danger. And so another area that we can look at and put together as far as the trauma side of things goes. And then the other part that we'll look at is from an attachment perspective. Okay? From attachment perspective, trauma is anything that threatens my attachment. Anything that threatens my attachment to a major caregiver. Now this is really important, especially when we get in a minute into what's called covert trauma. So we have regular trauma, which is the stuff that we tend to think about, violence in the home, domestic violence, things of that nature. And those pieces are all really important and valuable. And then we have a thing called covert trauma. So we're going to get to that next. Let me grab my eraser here. So here we have the basic definition that we're going to go with moving forward. And now we're going to split that into 5 broad categories. So category 1 is physical. Okay, physical trauma. And now each category is also going to have 2 subcategories. We're going to talk about overt, and we're going to talk about covert. Now, overt, and this might be a fancy word for some folks, overt means obvious. Covert means not obvious, kind of subtle, like maybe I wouldn't notice it if I wasn't paying attention. Maybe it actually looks like a nice thing. Maybe everything looks great here, and really we realize that underneath it, there's something else going on. So that's covert trauma. So covert or overt physical abuse. Examples of overt physical abuse might be getting beaten up, getting attacked, getting hit, getting pushed, getting pinched. Covert physical abuse would be the absence of touch in the household. I can think of a very famous person who was involved in the pornography industry for years. It was the guy who owned Playboy magazine. And he talked a lot about the idea that his mother, he never remembered his mother touching him. Is that interesting? It's really acute physical trauma in that situation, but not in the way that we would normally think of. Emotional abuse, overt emotional abuse is just basically shaming another individual, okay? Telling somebody by word or deed that they are less than, that they are not worthy, that they are not valuable. Other forms of emotional abuse might be utilizing fear to manipulate or to control, things like that. Those are emotionally abused things that are overt. Covert emotional abuse can be growing up in a household where there is no opportunity for emotional expression at all, or where one particular emotion is not okay. A lot of highly religious households that I work with, anger, for example, is deeply, deeply suppressed. Or we only have one person in the household who can allow for anger to come out. So that's an example of covert abuse in that regard. Intellectual. An intellectual abuse is abusing someone and telling them that they are dumb or unintelligent, or that they're not able to make it in the world as far as their intellect goes, when that's not true. And if it is true, and I do it in a way that is shaming or inappropriate, I'm also in that situation really perpetrating some intellectual abuse. Now, covert intellectual abuse is setting someone up for failure in terms of giving them expectations that are not realistic. Okay, you're the dumbest is pretty abusive. You're the smartest, actually, can be equally abusive and challenging because it's not true. The kid's going to get into the world and have a very painful discovery, and the discovery is that I'm actually not the smartest. I'm not the most valuable because of my intellect. So intellectual abuse can show up with some regularity clinically. So spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse is any form of abuse at the hands of a spiritual caregiver. And what happens is, if I have a spiritual caregiver, what they're doing is providing me my sense of connection to a power greater than self, and they're also going to corrupt that sense of connection to a power greater than self with their own trauma and abuse for them to get in the way. That's overt spiritual abuse. Covert spiritual abuse might be simply the absence of spiritual education of any kind, right? And when I say spiritual education, I'm being pretty broad here. The idea that there isn't anything in the world more important than you is problematic and challenging, okay? And so that's where what we're talking about as far as covert spiritual abuse. And then the last one, of course, is sexual abuse. Overt sexual abuse is pretty easy to spot, pretty easy to look at. It is involuntary sexual contact, and or sexual contact between when somebody is not of an appropriate age to give consent. That's overt sexual abuse, pretty straightforward. Covert sexual abuse is very prevalent and a little more challenging to see. Being exposed to explicit sexual material prior to puberty is actually, generally speaking, covertly sexually abusive. Okay, it's going to start to move things around in my nervous system that really are not ready to move around and cause a lot of challenges. Having a household where sexual energy is kind of loose all over the place is very confusing for a kid. That's an example of covert sexual abuse. Emotional incest. And we know what emotional incest is. Emotional incest is when one parent uses a child to get their needs met, and specifically the needs that they should be getting met through a spouse or partner. So it's sort of like the incest without the sex or the sexual, without the touching part. So I have, if I'm working with compulsive sexual behavior, I will often find with heterosexuals that their opposite sex parent is their best friend. Okay? And with homosexuals, their same-sex parent is their best friend, and they work on a relationship at a level of closeness that's more peer-to-peer, more connected in that regard than is typical. What else? So early exposure to pornography, other examples of covert sexual abuse, those are probably the biggest ones that come up as far as the abuse side of things goes. So that is the basic run of different forms of trauma that as clinicians we want to look at and try to resolve. The basic question that comes up is, Greg, how do I resolve the issue? And that's obviously a pretty complex topic. But the simplest answer that I have found is, as a kid, okay, when I'm a little kid, there is either material that should not be there, okay, overt stuff, or there's material that should be there. Okay? As a clinician, my job is to figure out what was there that shouldn't have been and help that to resolve, or what was missing that should have been there and help that to resolve. Okay? So that's the nuts and bolts of that variety of trauma. The final classification that we throw in here is neglect. Okay, and neglect is its own class, right? So we have these 5 here. Neglect is really about the attachment system and the absence of feeling like there is a safe person who is ready and willing to take care of me in my immediate environment. And that also is a form of generally pretty covert trauma. Some people are very aware of it. You can be emotionally neglected, for example, and have all your physical needs met, and be very confused about why things are going the way they're going, why you're feeling the way you're feeling. Okay, so that's a pretty solid overview. We'll stop there for now. And any questions? We're good.